try it now, John.
Test, test.
We're good. Okay.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening to those online. I'm John Fike, lay leader here at Otterbein United Methodist Church with Pastor Ash Welch. And this is session 3 of our Bible study, 24 Hours That Changed the World. So we will go ahead and open with prayer. Would you bow your heads, please? O Lord, God of my salvation, when at night I cry out in your presence, let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit.
And I'm reading from Mark chapter 14, beginning at verse 53, and it'll jump over some verses along the way, so just follow along in your Bibles if you wish. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death. The high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard this blasphemy. What is your decision?" All of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to strike him, saying, "Prophesy." The guards also took him over and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, "You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are talking about." After a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are Galilean." But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. You know, John, Peter made a mistake. He had known Jesus so well. But there, at the last minute, he just simply made a mistake. That's what I think. He denied Jesus, although he loved Jesus. And later on, Jesus gives him a chance to correct that. When he asks him, "Peter, do you love me?" 3 times. And 3 times, Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know I do." I make mistakes too. And I made a mistake tonight. Actually, last night. You see, this book, The Leader Guide, my wife and I are sharing this. And last week, she handed it to me. I put it down on the bench where I put my coat on and walked out the door without it. So last week, you had to do the prayer and the reading, right? This week, she handed it to me last night, and she said, "Better read your lesson." And I read it over, and I chose the wrong lesson. I goofed. So the question that I sent to you is for next week. But that's okay, because we're looking at 24 hours, and within those 24 hours, things that happened to Jesus are what we're examining. So the question I sent you last night was, can you think of a time when you or someone you know was in prison? We're going to talk about that, John and I are tonight, but hang on to what we have to say, because you'll get that again next week when Jesus is before Pilate. Okay? But it's all the same process where he was ridiculed, and then he was thrown into a pit and tied and shackled and beaten. So we'll talk tonight about being imprisoned.
Yeah, sure. So I've, over the course of my life, I've had the chance to tour jails, and you kind of walk through, and you don't get a real great feel for what goes on there, other than you see the cells and inmates, and it's a depressing place. But I don't think you really fully grasp the true feeling of folks who are imprisoned there, walking through there, and we actually have a distant family member who is incarcerated, and I think that you hit the nail on the head, right? He made a mistake and has some issues that hopefully will be addressed. But when you go to jail, you have nothing, like literally nothing. And I was unaware of that until we learned of his plight, and the fact that somebody needed to get to the jail to get some money so that he could purchase things from the commissary. You literally get a jumpsuit and shoes. That's it. No undergarments, no blanket, no additional food, nothing to read. Obviously, none of your belongings, no phone. So you think about that. I think we see on television, people in jail. I don't think they do a great job of depicting. I mean, imagine being taken to jail from your home, stripped of all your possessions, no visitors, no anything. I can't even wrap my head around the idea of not even an undergarment or a simple blanket or pillow. It's worse than I would have ever imagined. So that was been eye-opening, and quite honestly, somewhat struggling with that in my mind.
So let me just ask you real quick. The person who was incarcerated, was that person found guilty of a crime?
Not yet.
Okay.
So waiting
waiting
for the process.
So
yes.
In the process right now of whether that person will go free and be released or not. Right?
Correct.
Okay. And you're absolutely right. Everything is taken away from you when you go in. I spent a night in jail once. This was in my first appointment over 30 years ago. A member of my church thought it would be nice for me to experience what that really feels like starting out in ministry as a young pastor. And so the new Morrow County Jail had just been completed, but not opened yet, not officially. And he took me there, and I had no idea what we were going into. I thought it was the Rural Cooperative Building when we pulled up out front and parked in the parking lot. There was still no sign put up in front of it saying Morrow County Jail. And as we walked in, I was asked to hand over my keys and my watch and my wallet and my belt and my shoes. And I walked through a metal detector to make sure I had nothing on me. And then, like you said, I was handed a jumpsuit. I had my choice of green or orange. I chose green that night, that morning, early morning. I chose green because I was told that means I get to sleep in the dormitory with a lot of people, other people. My friend chose orange. I made a big mistake that day. I found out the next morning when I got out of bed, I hadn't slept but about 3 or 4 hours because everybody else in that room was snoring or tossing and turning, and the beds were steel and they were hard. And my friend slept in solitary. That's why he had the orange jumpsuit. And he got a perfect 8 hours of sleep that night because nobody bothered him the whole night long. So that was a thing I learned about when we came out of there on Sunday morning. They let us out with just enough time to get to church. I didn't have time to go home and shower and shave and change into a suit. But as we came out of the doors, they handed me back my clothes and my wallet and my watch and my keys and my belt and my shoes. But they didn't give back my dignity. That's the one thing that was missing. And that's what's happening here in this story. Imagine what it was like for Jesus when he was being mocked and told that he was blaspheming against God. Here's God. How can God blaspheme against God? Can't happen. And then, worst of all, came Peter's denial. You know Jesus knew that was going to happen. He predicted it. And you know it was happening while it was happening. Can you imagine how Jesus felt being condemned? Condemned by those who claimed to be righteous, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the high priests. But he was also at that point condemned and denied by the one who was truly righteous, St. Peter. So that's what we're going to look at tonight as we go and break into our breakout sessions. We're going to explore this event along the way of Jesus. But now we've got a video for you, and I'm going to go back there and turn on the video and switch the live stream from camera to video.
As we continue our study of the final hours of Jesus' life, we turn to the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, and the abandonment and denial of Jesus by Simon Peter. As Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas Iscariot came, leading a crowd who had come with swords and clubs from the Sanhedrin. It was after midnight. Judas came and kissed his master, a sign that Judas had given to the guards indicating which man was to be arrested. The disciples reach for their weapons, and Peter slices off the ear of the high priest's slave. But Jesus will have none of this. Luke, the physician, tells us that Jesus heals the servant's ear, while John tells us the name of the man, Malchus, and that it was his right ear. With this, the disciples ran, and Jesus was left alone with the crowd of thugs. The only disciple still with him now was Judas. Bound, Jesus is led back across the Kidron Valley and back up to Mount Zion, to the high priest's home. Now, while in Jerusalem, I found it helpful to make this journey myself. It was about a 20-minute walk for me, and going uphill, it left me winded. Let's get a sense of what this walk was like. This is the path that Jesus would have taken as he was led away from the Garden of Gethsemane and led to the place where he would be tried by the Sanhedrin at night. And so we're on our way up to the city of Zion, and we are passing through the Kidron Valley and to the Church of St. Peter Gallicantu. So this is the path. We've just walked through the Kidron Valley, where Jesus would have been led sometime after midnight with the guards from the temple with their torches, and he would have been taken up here. The disciples all had fled by this time, and when he comes up the Kidron Valley, he comes up the path from the Kidron Valley, he comes out right here at the southern wall of the temple, where he'd taught many times, and near the teaching steps, where he had addressed the disciples and where he had predicted the downfall of Jerusalem. And he continued the journey up the pathway to the lower city of David and finally to the upper city of David, to the house of high priest Caiaphas. It was here that the Sanhedrin was meeting by night so as to not anger the crowds. It was in secret in order to silence Jesus once and for all. Now, the old Roman road still stands here. The Roman steps, and pilgrims who come this way often will take off their shoes so as to walk barefoot on the path that Jesus was walking on, to remember and to mark that last leg of his journey to the high priest's house. And somehow, as I feel these large Roman stones under my feet, I feel myself identifying, and really even just wondering, what was Jesus thinking? What was he feeling? Was he winded as I am after making this journey? Was he afraid? Or was he trusting once more in the God who would deliver him? The Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu marks the traditional location of the palace of the high priest Caiaphas and the site of the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin. It's built atop ruins that date back to the time of Christ. As with any of the places you might visit in the Holy Land, we cannot know for certain that this is the exact location, but there are interesting features of this site that certainly help us to imagine what Jesus was experiencing on that night. So let's take a closer look at St. Peter in Gallicantu. These ruins, ancient mikvah, that is ritual baths and cisterns, are thought to be the remains of the high priest Caiaphas' home. From the earliest centuries, Christians gathered here, and they remembered that Jesus was brought to this place for his trial before the Sanhedrin at night, and they remembered the place where Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. In 1889, this room was discovered. It had been filled with rubbish for centuries, and as archaeologists began to dig underneath the high priest's house, Caiaphas' home, what they found was evidence that there had been prisoners who were kept here. You see the place where the shackles would have been held, suspending the prisoner by their arms. And as the archaeologists began to uncover this place, they found evidence of Byzantine crosses that very early in the history of the church, Christians came here and they marked the imprisonment and the suffering of Jesus. Some even wondered whether he had been scourged himself before going to Pontius Pilate to be scourged, whether Jesus himself had his arms suspended here that night and was beaten first by the guards of the high priest. And when we read in Acts chapter 5 that Peter and John were in prison for their faith because they refused to stop speaking in the name of Jesus, this may very well have been the place where they were kept in prison. In ancient times, prisons were often no more than a pit, a cistern or a dried well dedicated as a prison. People were lowered into them, and if you were to visit the Mamertine prison in Rome, where tradition holds that Peter was in prison before his death, you would find it also as a pit. Under the church at St. Peter in Gallicantu is such a pit, and it's believed that Jesus would have been held in this place from the time that he was tested and questioned before the Sanhedrin until he was turned over to Pilate. Maybe 5, 6, perhaps even 7 hours he spent in this dark place, in this pit. This is the dungeon, the pit where tradition says Jesus was lowered into as he was awaiting the outcome of his trial before the Sanhedrin. He could hear them debating his fate from this place. And as was common in the dungeons of the time, he would have been lowered by a rope placed around his chest, dropped down slowly into this place. He sat here in the darkness that night. And here we remember the words of Psalm 88, where the psalmist writes, "I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like a man without strength. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths." And one can't help but wonder if Jesus was pondering these same words as he sat in the darkness in this room. Finally, when the trial was over, the rope was lowered again, and he was drawn out from the pit, and the sentence was passed. He'd be turned over to Pilate to be crucified. All 4 Gospels tell us that while Jesus was on trial before the Sanhedrin, the other disciples had fled. They were in hiding, except Peter, who followed at a distance as they were bringing Jesus to the home of Caiaphas. Actually, John tells us that he was there as well. We focus on the fact that Peter would deny Jesus 3 times this night, but perhaps we should also remember that only Peter had the courage to actually come to the place Jesus was being tried. He went so far as to enter the courtyard. He was attempting to make good on his promise that though the others would flee, he would not leave Jesus. Here's how Mark tells the story. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she stared at him and said, You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I do not know or understand what you're talking about." And he went out into the forecourt, and then the cock crowed. And the servant girl, on seeing him again, began once more to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But he denied it. Then after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know this man you're talking about." At that moment the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. We're standing here at the courtyard of the high priest Caiaphas' house, the courtyard outside of the church at St. Peter Gallicantu. And perhaps my favorite part of this courtyard is the statue that was placed here in 1957. It's a statue of Peter denying 3 times his Lord, and the cock crowing above. And it reminds us, of course, as we stand in this place, that if Peter denied Jesus and was still restored, there's hope for us when we have denied Jesus, when we've turned our backs on him or failed to acknowledge him. If there was hope for Peter, there's hope for us.
Okay, turning. Where's the mouse? Okay, so I had to find the right button to turn off the DVD audio. So we're going to break into groups, but before we do, let me apologize for saying I was mistaken before. My wife tells me there was once a time when I thought I was wrong, but I was mistaken. I was on the right page, and I just didn't realize it until we watched the video, and it showed that chamber down underground, that pit where Jesus was incarcerated for the night. And I did want to give you a postscript on my experience of spending the night in jail. As I pointed out, the next morning, my friend drove me from the jail across Morrow County to the little country church where I was serving, little one-room church, all farm folks who worship there. And I walked in my green jumpsuit and announced to them why I was wearing the jumpsuit, that I'd spent the night in jail and why I hadn't shaved or washed my hair or anything. And I said, but we're going to proceed with worship because it's not about me, it's about God. And they were all fine with that. It was great. We had a good worship, but after the offering was taken up, the ushers came up to me with the plates to turn around and have them blessed before the altar. And when I turned around and faced the altar and held the plates before the altar to pray to God in thanksgiving, they started all laughing. They all broke out laughing, and I thought, what did I do that made them laugh? And so I turned back around and said, what happened? And they said, when you turned around, we saw on the back of your jumpsuit, it says, Morrow County Jail. We gave all our money to a jailbird. So, yeah, that's the postscript on that little story. But the reality is that what Jesus went through that night was no picnic. He'd had the picnic, the party with the Passover feast that he celebrated with his disciples. And from then on, the journey just goes uphill from there, literally goes uphill, as we saw tonight on the video. So we won't talk here about what you experienced while you were watching that video, but I hope you learned something, and I hope you continue with the lesson as you go forward in your home study or in our classes. I'll now dismiss us for our classes. So go in peace, and we'll see you again next week.